This is the Medieval and Early Modern Monsters panel. I'm Kim Lau. I teach here at UCSC in the Literature Department. Our first speaker today is Vale Prosper from the University of Georgia, and I will let her present her own title.
Yes. Hi, my name is Vale. Before I get started really quickly, I'd like to recognize my place of speaking. I come from a place of both privilege and trauma. I'm white, I'm very educated, my family is also educated and wealthy, and I am also trans and mad. So we're sitting at a fun intersection, and today I am also going to touch on a community that was very similarly privileged and traumatized the way that I am, historical disparity notwithstanding. But I do hope that ultimately this case study and my findings can be used by others to speak about their experiences of marginalization and oppression. I would also like to say that in my abstract, I promised a physical demonstration, and due to some recent health concerns, I will not be able to follow through on that. I am just as mad as you are about that. But, you know, if doctors believed women, we wouldn't be here. Anyways, so on September 21st of 1632, the Mother Superior Jeanne des Anges, Marthe de Sainte-Monique, and Gabrielle de l'Incarnation see the ghost of their deceased prior. And by October 5th, Jeanne Clara de Saint-Jean and Louise de Jesus are confirmed possessed by demons. 14 will be confirmed later. And for the next 7 years, Jeanne is plagued by demons and priests, suffering immensely at both hands. She's later healed by Jean-Joseph Surin, who's a priest with a much gentler approach to exorcism, and as the final demon leaves her body, her hand is marked with the names of Jesus, Mary, Joseph, and a recent French saint. She visits the king after this, who proclaims it a miracle, and goes back to Loudun, where she slips away into death at the age of 63. And if you're familiar with the demonic possessions of Loudun, you might be wondering where some of the more important characters are, but there's a big problem that I'm having, and you let me know if you could spot it. Historiographically speaking, narratively speaking, there is a massive shadow cast over the Ursulines, who are the inciting epicenter of this whole thing, to the point where they are decentered from their own story. And so it looks like this. It looks like a lot of attention and a lot of sympathy for an innocent man, and erasure and scrutiny for the sisters. And that's the rot. There's a rot in the way that we tell, study, and know this event. They are less their own selves and more someone else's thesis. They're more devil than woman. They're more ramification for church and country than an actual living person. And many interpret this moment in history as hysteria, which is just about the most diminishing word for the actuality of a human experience. I would like to clarify a couple of things. I have argued elsewhere that previous work on this is not necessarily wrong. It's important to connect the Ursulines to the contexts in which they participate, and this should be considered illuminative to the epoch. That's a different paper. What I'm going to do today is talk about the taste in my mouth of this pervasive, bitter aloofness at best and voyeurism at worst that tends to haunt women's history and really any oppressed community that falls victim to hegemony. I'm also not saying that the posited theories of what really happened in this moment can be correct, but approaching this case with that question of what really happened is part of the rot. Stuart Clark advises against using modern psychology to diagnose supernaturally events, as the distances between us and them obfuscate results and truth. I advise against it because the question implicitly doubts the experiences of women. And so if you approach the Ursulines like this, you refuse to explore the possibility that she's right, and that her being right is not necessarily demons existing, but that something is happening. What really happened to me is located in where it really happened somatically, emotionally, in her body-mind as an exterior manifestation of an interior experience. So I also want you to request that I want to request that you regard what I share today as supposition. I believe in my argument, but I want to remind us of the limits of academic authority when we speak on human subjects. If we believe that we definitively speak for the dead, I think we open ourselves up to the sin of speaking over them, and then soon after the living. So I know that we do so in good faith in the pursuit of knowledge, but prioritizing what we consider to be objective truth cuts us off from exploring new knowledge and new ways of knowing. So rather than a site of psychological study, this event is a discussion of the ineffable. And so it relies on feeling as knowledge, which challenges and unsettles a patriarchal ivory tower. The ineffable is still very human. It just gets caught in our throats, for lack of a word. So I went off in search of this unwritten and wordless language. And this all hit me as I was doing dramaturgy and research. This is the topic of my doctoral thesis, and I'm writing a play about it. And so because of that, I felt traditional dramaturgy was going to weaken what I was ultimately trying to accomplish. Loudon has tons of documentation and firsthand accounts. Those accounts were written by men, and during a Catholic-Protestant divide. Sarah Ferber points out that as soon as an argument is made using the demons, possessions, exorcisms to defend one of the faiths, then the other faith was very quick to turn it against them. And even before high-profile characters get involved, the rigorous examination of the exorcists evaluating the sisters for veracity just kind of dusts these accounts with a fine grain of salt. I feel pretty safe to say that there's some polemic bias in what was written at the time. We do have Jean des Anges' own account of what happened, and I'm going to circle back later to why that poses an issue. But still, this is what's available to me. I got to use it. But I'm going to go another way. I'm going to find another way about it, because as Audre Lorde warns, you can't use the master's tool to dismantle the master's house. So I started considering a different primary source as the Ursuline Soma. I think recentering the story to me ultimately means bringing the site of knowledge back to sisters' bodies. And this makes sense for two reasons. I'm a somatic-based practice as research scholar artists, specializing in embodiment, writing a play. I was going to do this anyways. But two, more importantly, devotional worship for nuns was focused on the corporeal, either in asceticism or in contemplation. The divine or the carnal are communicated with by soma and sensate. And Judith C. Brown talks about this in connection with Benedetta Carlini's visions and how heavily her visions feature physical activity, like Christ exchanging his heart with hers, which is common in other female saints as well. Other visions from women saints involve literally touching Christ, could be tonally erotic or romantic. And St. Teresa of Avila, in her collected last visions in the interior castle, anchors ineffable feelings to the tangible body, and she uses the body to locate spiritual feelings. At one point she writes, "I can't help but wonder what's going on inside my own head. It sounds like there are a multitude of rushing rivers inside my head, their waters cascading downward, surrounded by many little birds and other whistling sounds. This is all unfolding not in the ears, but in the upper part of the head, where they say the higher part of the soul resides. The spirit seems to push its way upward with great power and speed." And then she later mentions that metaphors are the only, if still inadequate, way to explain her exultant experiences. But if you share these experiences, you're going to get it. I do also think it's important to mention another precedent in the history of religious women of creating a mystic language. So Hildegard von Bingen, for purposes really only known to herself, created a lingua ignota. This is not something that we fully understand, and this was centuries away from the Ursulines, and it's textual, not physical, but I want to mention it nonetheless to bring to mind how creative religious women are when it comes to feeling as knowledge, especially when we start to escape linguistics. So we've got a rich tradition of sisters showing us ingenuity in communicative descriptions, and that when available lexicons fail their purposes, it's very possible to make another one. And lexicons fail, not just in the mouth of the describer, but in the ears of the receiver, although in the case of the latter, sometimes that's a willful deafness, at its least malicious, but still very harmful. Deafness is disbelief, and at its most insidious, it's oppression, which erases, undermines, and devalues what we know, and yet not what was known in the time that it happened by the people who experienced it. Dangerously, this enforced silence displaces the self from its own soma. It fragments the person inside of it. And so perhaps ineffable can signify the divide between you and knowledge and is spotted by the gap in your understanding. Maybe it's the friction between what you know is, but an oppressor can't afford to validate at the risk of losing power. So hysteria, right? Hysteria is a word that does point to mental and emotional anguish of women experiencing trauma, but it does so in a way that immediately disregards and prevents women from getting the care that they need. So where am I going with this? As a refresher, I'm trying to get out of historical rhetoric, right, baked in patriarchal systems of church and state to generate new historiography. I'm thinking with demonic possession as an actualization of self-knowledge and an expression of how violent it feels when you suddenly slam into that self-knowledge, and an expression of how violent it feels when you suddenly slam. It's a realization. It's a realization of the way that you have been betrayed by culture, country, and it's still happening. It's still affecting us today, not just in the way that we know our history, but in the way that we know ourselves. That's where I've been going this whole time. And so what I did about it, right, is I took a large sheet of paper and a Sharpie, and I wrote down every recorded description of possession from these sisters from available accounts, and I recreated them. Each one. It felt to me that the only way to suture the rift between me and these sisters was through my body. So I designed several exercises as research meditations. I'm reperforming, but I'm ultimately co-witnessing the past. I'm trying to co-create a new historiography. I'm drawing on my training in yoga, Butoh, Fitzmaurice, and Alba emoting, with the purpose to incite and engage my sensate. I held these described shapes to muscle failure. I was trying to reach a point of exhaustion. And I also laughed in a room of no one for like 5 segments of 10 minutes straight because I wanted to explore the cathartic reaction. I was very sore. I was very exhausted. And then I started to get way more involved than I ever thought possible. So this dramaturgy starts turning ritualistic. It becomes very spiritual. I'm drifting into the non-rational and the non-linear, and I start becoming. The feeling knowledge is transformative, and I found way more than their history in my bones. And so I can only explain this next bit in the non-linear way that it happened. So follow me with this one. One morning, right, my back and my legs unexpectedly and painfully seize, and I stopped walking. I could not walk. I saw a physical therapist who asked about my life. And the French have 2 words. The French have 2 words for possession to delineate between an external assault and an inward invasion. And so knowing that transformed my first question: what feeling knowledge can I reach when I recreate what's recorded, into what if I let feeling I can't name yet surface somatically in me? I tell my physical therapist I was in a traumatic marriage. It's okay, I'm divorced now. And she goes, yep, that'll do it. And I don't know what that means yet, but I start to wonder, can I induce a possessive state in myself? Not act. I can't act for beans. I did not go to school for acting. I mean like inducing. And from a theater and performance standpoint, possession can be a mask that speaks like a truer than truth, as it embraces the illogic that life is really full of, and it moves the ineffable through layers of epidermis and cognition. And then my therapist dug her elbow into my psoas, and I screamed, and I sobbed, because apparently grief is nonlinear and is an ostensibly somatic thing. I do not feel comfortable speaking for the Ursulines, but by my 4th research session, as a distinct memory of my own trauma, resurfaced, I felt that co-creating, walking and talking with Jean, I got it. The event and the memory and the sensation of my own trauma was visceral, as visceral as I felt these possessions must have been. For me, it felt like fiery regret. I heard my abuser's derision. It specifically entered my left ear. It burned. It was like burrowing flies. It trickled into my ribs, and it turned into a carriage for rage. And this conjured in me vignettes and images of a bird throwing itself against a window, or a wolf hunched over a heart, a lizard scrambling up the side of a terrarium. And I just thought, God, I get it. So in closing, here's a fun fact for you. Hysteria was accepted as a diagnosis until 1980, and it was researched by Jean-Martin Charcot, whose students, as a present to honor him and his work, edited and annotated Jean Desange's autobiography. So if I want to read it, I have to go to France, where they have the original manuscript, because the one that's published and in circuit is that edited copy. So the thing about historiography and academia and speaking over people is that it never just concerns the past. Our understanding of these Ursulines and many like them is a void of willingness to learn and validate what could have been a traumatic and mystic language. I was very fortunate to be able to co-create and walk and talk with the past, and I would invite the rest of us to follow similar strange paths. So, thank you.
That's good. Our next speaker is Lena Tai, here at the University of California, Santa Cruz in the literature department. And Lena can come up and share her own title. And you have no slides?
No slides.
Okay,
Yes.
great.
Thank you so much, Kim, for introducing me, and thank you so much, everyone, for listening in on my very first conference paper ever. No slides. No slides, but I do have a paper, and I titled it A Song for Tituba, a Marvelous and Monstrous Femininity in John Milton's Paradise Lost and Maryse Condé's Tituba. As Tituba awaits trial for accusations of witchcraft in Maryse Condé's novel Tituba, she encounters a woman named Hester, who is awaiting trial for accusations of adultery. This Hester is a fantastical reimagining of the Scarlet Letters Hester, written by Nathaniel Hawthorne, and this Hester identifies as a feminist. After applauding John Milton's Paradise Lost and calling it a marvel, which means a miracle or a miraculous thing of wonderment, Condé's Hester says she wishes to write a novel where women are in power. Although she doesn't explicitly say what makes it a marvel, we can assume that she is praising its portrayal of Eve, as she is an avid reader and a feminist herself. The story of Adam and Eve is first introduced to Tituba by her future husband, John Indian, who describes Adam as turned out of earthly paradise because of Eve. Hester, on the other hand, introduces the tale through Milton. Both Eve and Tituba are constructed as monstrous by their interlocutors, but thankfully Tituba has Hester to reveal that she isn't a monster and that the monstrosity attributed to her is the feminine agency they both have. In Milton's rewriting, unlike the original creation story, Eve is afforded agency with a characterization that demonstrates a complex and dynamic internal life. Milton establishes that the first parents found pleasure in conversation, with Eve remarking that, with Adam conversing, she forgets all time. Eve, after and even before the fall, is open to sharing and talking as she was born in and for community, while Adam becomes reclusive and resentful despite his initial patience and thoughtfulness. Eve asks about the stars and where they go when she and Adam sleep, and Adam answers in a way she enjoys. Her feelings of safety and security listening to Adam as her teacher precedes her walking away in Book 8 from Raphael and her husband. She walks away not because she is incapable of understanding the content of the discussion, but because she does not delight in it, nor in Raphael as a speaker. This is a choice that Eve makes, without any other character's guidance or input. The ability to choose is powerful, which is why, despite knowing of Satan's presence in the garden, God allows him in anyway. He wanted to allow Adam and Eve the power of choice. Eve works to save the marriage by talking to Adam after the fall. While Adam soliloquizes alone, and then, as the namer of things, denounces Eve as a serpent, she approaches the situation with the humility of Christ, offering compassion and peace. It is established in Paradise Lost that the main and only person to soliloquize up until this point is Satan, with soliloquies associated with fallenness. In a similar fashion to when she first turned away from Adam, Adam turns away from her, opening up the opportunity to reach out and, in this instance, reconnect. Eve, at his feet fell humble, asks that between us two, let there be peace, both joining, as joined in injuries, one enmity. And with her imperfect act of reconciliation, Adam is brought back into relational existence from isolation. She is not prideful, unlike Adam or Satan, and this is ultimately the way Adam, Eve, and their love are saved. After briefly mentioning Milton as a male author she makes a rare exception to read, Hester imagines her model society, where women raise children on their own. Tituba jokingly responds that we women can't make them alone, even so. To which Hester says it is a shame that those abominable brutes are able to share in the fleeting moment at all. Teasing, Tituba admits that the moment needn't be too short, as she likes to take her time. Hester laughs and lightheartedly admits defeat in making Tituba a feminist. She jokes that Tituba is too fond of love, which is apparently a barrier to becoming a feminist, according to Hester. However, Tituba's actions reveal a sense of agency that could be called feminist. Whether she is independent or involved with another person, Tituba always exercises agency and the power of choice. Although married for a number of years, Tituba begins to perceive her partner differently, following a period of separation that accentuates his worst attributes. Their first interaction is initiated by John Indian, who confirms Tituba's name and comments on her appearance, asking if she is aware of her slovenliness and asserting, "It's not surprising people are afraid of you. You don't know how to talk, and your hair is a tangle. Have you looked at yourself?" Speechless, Tituba describes her inability to talk as the words flying away, as if acting on their own, and not willing to contribute to the conversation, attributing agency to her words. Here, conversation becomes a trap. John Indian repeats the sentiment that individuals are scared of Tituba to capitalize on it. In laughing, he demonstrates that he isn't afraid of her, unlike everyone else apparently. While Milton's Adam's arguably biggest weakness is his attraction to his wife's beauty, John Indian uses conversation to degrade, manipulate, and plant the seeds of insecurity in Tituba. Unlike Eve's preliminary encounter with Adam, which is genuine and honest, John and Tituba's initial conversation is dishonest. Although he appears to be a bold character, in retrospect, Tituba comments that his eyes were fearful and rabbit-like in movement. He is afraid of Tituba and her confidence, which she developed away from society and with Mama Yaya, a Nago healer who took her in when she was orphaned and continued to care for her in death as a spirit. In an attempt to tame Tituba, John Indian insults her so that her confidence diminishes. He makes a monster of her, rendering her more receptive to his sexual advances. Tituba then begins to doubt herself. Up until now, I had never thought about my body. Was I beautiful? Was I ugly? I had no idea. What had he said? You know, you could be lovely. Could be. It will be in conversation with Mama Yaya and then Hester that she will rediscover her beauty and become confident again. John's later disloyalty is first foreshadowed by this lack of honesty and manipulative maneuvering of dialogue. John is, in many ways, Milton's Adam at his worst. In addition to frequently taking Tituba by the arm or hand, it is John who introduces the word witch to Tituba. I noticed, she comments, that when he said the word, it was with disapproval. This name-calling parallels Adam calling Eve a serpent after the fall. Serpent, witch, monster. Just like Adam is the namer of things, John will continue to give her various names, such as Little Wild Mare, throughout the text. John Indian's ability to call forth Tituba's insecurities and undermine her worth is only as powerful as Tituba allows it to be, however. In a reversal of roles, Tituba laughs at John when he wants her to live with him in his home. She responds disparagingly, "Your home? Since when does a slave have a home?" This annoys John, making it clear that he has no issues deriding others, despite awareness of the effects of his own words. Like Eve, Tituba also asks her Adam, John, plenty of questions, which he hears but chooses to ignore. One of the ways he seeks to silence her is by calling her a witch, a word that she learned to be ashamed of from him. Moreover, in contrast to the feminist reading of the first parents that Hester shares, John Indian introduces the story of Adam and Eve to blame the latter for the fall. As a man only preoccupied with his own survival, this act of blaming continues when slave owner Susanna Endicott attaches the term witch to Tituba as well, ultimately resulting in Tituba's apprehension. Hyper-aware of the consequences that accusations of witchcraft bring, John panics rather than consoles, his dialogue expressing worries about what Endicott says, recalling a governor setting slaves aflame when he believed them to have had dealings with Satan, and sharing with Tituba the fate of accused witches. He also sneers at Tituba in a way that echoes an accuser. Go tell that to the court. Later that night, he abandons Tituba physically for the first time, turning away from her and then leaving in the morning without a word. Like Eve, Tituba tries to connect with John after the conversation that might cause their doom, but John pushes her away. This distance foreshadows his abandonment of Tituba while she is imprisoned. After John admits that he too has joined the accusers, Tituba wonders whether, if she had found herself on that infamous platform, if he would have been capable of shouting, "Oh, Tituba's tormenting me. My wife is a witch." Just as Eve is an agent of love and reconciliation, Tituba is an agent of healing and love, though Tituba is ultimately abandoned by her Adam. Although Tituba was wrongfully accused of witchcraft and wrongfully imprisoned, John isn't there with her through any of it, unlike Adam, who was initially angry with and blamed Eve, but at least eventually listened to her and loved her nevertheless. Tituba is a capable, conversational, and loving woman who comforts others despite the racism and sexism she endures. She is a healer who thrives in what Victor Turner calls communitas, a connection in which people share an experience in a socially unstructured state and are all therefore equal. In this liminal space, Hester and Tituba are able to bond and build a sacred solidarity that undermines the oppressive structures that demonize and ostracize them. Unlike the way that John Indian talks to Tituba, the way Hester and Tituba chat is very natural. Interruptions are inquisitive rather than condescending, and any teasing is playful instead of duplicitous. The relationship they share thrives on conversation, and Tituba's ability to comfort with her words is especially evident when Hester asks that she talk to her unborn baby and tell her where Tituba came from. "Make her happy," Hester says to Tituba, "with a story." After this, Hester prepares Tituba for her testimony and trial. Hester advises her friend to give an account of what Satan looks like and witches' gatherings. "All this is ridiculous," says Tituba, who laughs at this, to which Hester assures, "No, it isn't, because they will believe it," a reminder that Tituba's words possess influence and power. Although the women are sadly separated at the end of the story, Tituba assures us that Hester and herself communicate, of course. "I can still smell the dried almonds on her breath. I can still hear the echo of her laugh. I know she is pursuing her dreams of establishing a world of women that will be more just and humane." Anne Armstrong Scarborough asks Maryse Condé in an interview whether a love that is positive is central to the text I, Tituba. Condé responds, "Love is always positive." Although Tituba is far from a typical feminist figure, she is still a strong female character, monstrous only in the eyes of the general society. According to Condé, being too fond of love, what seems to be Tituba's weakness, isn't a terrible thing. As we see through Tituba, being too fond of love is freely loving anyone unconditionally, beyond what society deems as normal, beyond boundaries that are economic, geographical, racial, social, and even the boundary of life and death. All of this is, as Jeffrey Jerome Cohen would define in his 7 Theses of Monster Theory, what monsters are: boundary breakers that insist on a radical rethinking of boundary and normality, a resistor of any classification established on hierarchy or a merely binary opposition. In the story, Tituba is worried about being forgotten. But what is Tituba, if not an unforgettable marvel, a miraculously loving person that was always able to communicate her truest desires despite all hardship, a powerful woman? Thank you.
Next up, and I think we're going to change slides, is that right? Next up, we have, I'll let you do that. Next up, we have Asa Simon Mittman from Cal State Chico and Susan M. Kim from Illinois State University.
Okay.
Okay,
Our paper is entitled Nurturing Empire. So one of the many, many pleasures of being at a conference with other monster people is that there are some things we don't have to explain. Monsters demonstrate. They are about categories of difference, and hence they are also about interrogations of how we write, read, view, represent, and know. They haunt and they remember. About 10 years ago, we came to our work on the 8th century whalebone box, known as the Franks casket, as fundamentally monster people. But as we began crafting this paper for this conference, we also began to recognize that what seemed initially like a turn away from monster studies in this particular project, the monster still haunts. Our own thinking remains indebted to, anchored in, and continually changed by the many insights from the worlds of monsters we began with in our earliest collaborations.
Before we turn to the Franks casket, with the theme of the conference in mind, we make a short detour to some of the most spectacular medieval representations of monstrous nurturing we know of, those in the 15th century, Sir Gother. We do so because these scenes, in their apparent excess, make explicit connections we also see in the representations of the Franks casket.
Sir Gother, as an infant, given 9 good knichtes rivers, sucked him so they lost their livers, which is to say he sucked them to death before biting his own mother's nipple off. What follows is an adolescent and adult career of rape and murder on an almost inconceivable scale, until Gother, learning that his father was a hairy fiend, visits the Pope and receives a penance that involves never speaking and eating only food torn from the mouths of dogs. The disciplining of Gother's monstrous appetite is coupled with the restoration of speech, both for Gother and for the emperor's daughter, whose ability to speak is restored in the revelation that Gother, the son of a hairy fiend, is now God's child. With the restoration of speech in this rehabilitation also comes the reiteration of empire. Sir Gother, as God's child, marries the emperor's daughter and eventually rules many a year an emperor of great power.
Most readers of Sir Gother remember not the great power of Emperor Gother, but the young Gother's monstrous appetites, what Aaron Hofstetter has called his awful hunger. That is, the power of empire is overwritten by its foundational violence, and in particular by the ways in which its monstrosity is not curbed, but rather nurtured, even if it must be subsequently reformed and redirected. Gother eventually only kills so-called Saracens. This is a racialized, dehumanized image of North African Muslims instead of his previous victims, nuns, priests, widows, and wet nurses. And here we use the word overwritten intentionally, given the poem's insistence that the text itself is written on parchment. Both writing and the material support for that writing are invoked and perhaps implicated in the poetic hero's final turn from Feltred Fiend, that's the hairy fiend, to the Son of God. Now, most overviews of the Franks casket tend to focus on, arguably, its most famous panel, the front panel featuring a riddle text identifying the whalebone that it's carved from, and images usually identified, as currently by the British Museum, as an episode from the Germanic story of Wayland the Smith and the Adoration of the Magi. We'll return to the whale, for sure, and to Wayland, at least elliptically here, and to the Magi, but only elsewhere. But before doing so, we wish to note that these identifications, like all identifications, already guide us to elide associations between monstrosity, nurturing, and representation that we might, given the very different context of Sir Gother, have seen otherwise. That the figure of Mary, with Jesus on her lap or in her womb, occupies a significant portion of the right side of the panel. That the story of Wayland is about enslavement, disfigurement, rape, death, and dismemberment, but also about the gruesome transformation of materials into artifacts. The smith forges cups from the skulls of the princes. That in the riddle text, the King of Terror, there are many other options for this translation, is stranded, perhaps, or hunted and killed before it is transformed into the artifact before us.
But especially coming to it in the context of Sir Gother, the left side panel of the Franks casket also suggests scenes of monstrous nurturing in the writing of empire. The text of the inscription in Old English and in runic letters reads, Romulus and Remus, 2 brothers, a wolf fed them in the town of Rome, far from native land. Texts on this object do not necessarily identify the scenes in the images, but just to begin with this textual evocation of Romulus and Remus, we note the central scene in this mythology of empire, the suckling of two boys by a wild animal in an alien place, far from home, though whether the twins' home or the home of the viewer is unclear to us.
In the version of the story provided perhaps most famously by Livy, the mother of Romulus and Remus is Rhea Silvia, forced to become a Vestal virgin. Quote, "The Vestal was forcibly violated and gave birth to twins. She named Mars as their father, either because she really believed it or because the fault might appear less heinous if a deity was the cause of it." Rhea Silvia is imprisoned, and the twins are set adrift in a river. The twins are, of course, saved, the river overflows, and the twins in a wooden cradle wash up on the shore. From Livy, "The locality was then a wild solitude. The tradition goes on to say that a thirsty she-wolf from the surrounding hills, attracted by the crying of the children, came to them, gave them her teats to suck, and was so gentle toward them that the king's flockmaster found her licking the boys with her tongue." While we probably accept that this scene is the moment likely depicted on the left side of the Franks casket, the image on the panel is not the image most modern viewers are accustomed to, or indeed the image most likely available in the Romano-British and medieval context, as it is associated with the circulation of imperial power in the form of coins. Note that in the coins, the tiny infants squatting and reaching up for the teats of the huge wolf who towers over them. We've examined hundreds of Roman, Romano-British, and early medieval English images of the suckling of Romulus and Remus. These are just a small handful of representative examples, and here's one you'll be able to see from the back of the room. And thus far, we have not found a single other example in which the wolf lies prone beneath the twins. In the vast majority of cases, the wolf stands over them, and they sit or crouch beneath, straining upward toward her. In a small handful, the wolf lies on her side, and the twins lie next to her. Thus far, and please let us know if you know otherwise. The Franks casket seems to visualize this scene in a novel and perhaps unique fashion. In the center of the panel, the seemingly adult-sized twins are depicted inverted, as if falling through the woods, as if sinking below the ripples of the Tiber. But at the base of the image, they land head first upon the teats of the wolf, lying on her back that stretches out her long tongue to lick the claw-like hand of the boy on the left. This scene about a pair of twins contains a curious doubling. At the top of the panel, presented in a sort of antipodal mirroring, is a second wolf unaccounted for in the tail that licks the foot of the boy on the right.
There are clearly substantive parallels between the infancies of Ser Gowther and Romulus and Remus as they appear in the various texts. All suckle wildly and strangely, and suckled, thus, all three of these male infants grow unusually strong and bold. The twins, in Livy, had as a special delight roaming through the woods on hunting expeditions, and as their strength and courage developed, they even attacked brigands when loaded with plunder. But the context of Ser Gowther also makes us consider the violence within this image of Romulus, Remus, and the wolf, or wolves. The wolf is here not the threatening martial wolf on the coins we've seen, on her back with one of the uncomfortably adult-looking nursing figures grasping her leg as if to pull it out of the way as he falls on her. This scene is less like gentle nurturing and more like assault.
It's worth noting that even Livy expresses strong doubt about the traditional account of Romulus and Remus's suckling by the wolf. Instead, he offers a sort of rational explanation. The king's flockmaster took the children to his hut and gave them to his wife, Laurentia, to bring up. Some writers think that Laurentia, from her unchaste life, had got the nickname of she-wolf among the shepherds, and that this was the origin of the marvelous story. While this removes the boys from the literal animal, it still ties their origin, and therefore the empire they go on to found, to another sort of wildness.
One might easily enough construct an argument that the early intimacy with the she-wolf's body metaphorically anchors the boys in the life of the alien land, and at the same time it affords them the strength and ferocity associated with the wild that they will later reveal and exploit. But the gentle licking in Livy's description and the agentiveness in the text on the casket, that is, a wolf fed them, not they suckled or they were suckled by, also suggests that this kernel of the narrative also requires that cross-species tenderness and even desire on the part of the she-wolf. Augustine's summary of the narrative provides as a possible explanation of this tenderness and desire the association between Mars and the she-wolf. In Augustine, the she-wolf is supposed to have presented her teats to the little children simply because she recognized in them the sons of Mars, her lord. That is, this is from City of God, the wolf's nurturing is a reinforcement of and a submission to paternal power. But Augustine, like Livy, also presents, even if he detours around it in a typical and familiar to monster studies, argument for God's power, the possibility that the wolf is not an actual wolf, but a harlot. That is, both narratives present the figure of a sexualized woman as a substitute for the nurturing animal, effectively underscoring, even in this turn, the element of desire in and directed toward the figure of the wolf.
Comparing the Frank's casket wolf, prone, forcefully grabbed, sucked on by two apparently grown men, to these supposed harlots invites further comparison, with the stock Roman scene of a prone, revealed figure attracting the attention of a god. There are many variants of this scene. In one version, a half-man, half-goat satyr pulls aside a sheet to reveal the sleeping Ariadne to Dionysus. In another, a satyr pulls back a sheet to reveal Hermaphroditus and often registers his transphobic shock at his discovery. These sorts of scenes are eventually transmuted by early Christians in the Roman Empire into images of Jonah, spit up by the whale and recovering in the shade, which is another tale of strange animal intimacies. But the variant we will consider here is that of the mother of Romulus and Remus, Rhea Silvia, spied by Mars, who will eventually assault her, and thereby will she conceive the twins. In this version, Rome is founded on an act of sexual violence, wherein the god of war is aided and abetted by one of the bearded gods of sleep. This is Somnus or his son Morpheus, who drugs her so that Mars can attack her. This stone casket image is a far cry from the Frank's casket image, and yet, in both, there is a prone female figure, made available by the artist for consumption by both the male figures within the scene and the male viewers standing before it. Rhea Silvia and the wolf are both crammed into their overfull scenes, both sheltered by a curving tree, both seemingly at the mercy of the overbearing, violent male figures hurtling toward them.
The Frank's casket panel, however, also pushes against a perspective that would allow for the identification with the male figures within the image. The text surrounding the image does not allow us to read as Western readers are generally taught to read, from left to right. Rather, the runic text reads from the left upper corner to the right, from the right top to bottom, from the lower right, right to left, and upside down, and from the left lower bottom to the top. To read the text, given the limitations we acquire as literate people, we found ourselves in the first 7 or so hours of our initial examination at the British Museum tilting our heads, as Vale suggests, really. And then coming as close to lying on our backs as we could in front of the vitrine. That is, identifying the scene in the image through the text also meant assuming the position not of the consuming man-boys, but of the nurturing wolf.
The flow of text around this scene, which is different from the patterns of the text on all its other panels, recalls the flow of text on the coins. That would have been the most common point of reference for images of this tale. These texts are written in the inward-facing format still familiar to us from modern coins. With a coin held in the hand, the reader can rotate the object more easily to read the letters around the edge, so they move into a position upright relative to our own. With the casket, a more cumbersome object and one designed to hold something within it, rotating the whole thing seems less likely, even for the original owners who could have done whatever they wanted with it. Never mind for the modern viewer looking through the plexiglass of its vitrine. Even when we had the privilege of viewing it out of its case, we most certainly were not going to flip it over. This means that while we might rotate a coin to suit our reading convenience, the casket asks us to contort ourselves, to bend to its visual logic, regardless of the vertigo this might generate.
I saw that.
She gave us a 1, so why don't we go to you here?
Here?
Yeah.
Okay. So we have a little transition here, but we're just going to skip it to talk about the secret writing that occurs on a different panel of the casket and the challenges that secret writing always poses to us as literate readers. That is, it shows to us the blind spots of literacy. So a secret text, for example, can encipher a message in a subtle change of font or by presenting something that looks like an image but is a text, like the runes Hahal Runa that Asa skipped over. These are great and we're happy to talk about them later. But one of the things that is most compelling about the Hahal Runa and other kinds of enciphered texts is that they let us see what we can't see otherwise. To us, probably the most compelling blind spot of literacy is the materiality of the sign, which always points away from itself to something else. In monster studies, we are trained to see what the monster requires us to see, that the monster cannot always point away from himself. In fact, in order to be a monster, they have to point toward themselves. In the sense, the casket presents us with an invitation, or maybe an imperative, to see also from the perspective of the animal consumed in the Romulus and Remus panel, but furthermore, as that famous front panel proclaims, to see that whatever its texts and images might signal and whatever it may have carried within it, the casket also remains part of the whale, cast up on the shingle that does not signify and that mourns. Thank you.
Thank you.
And our next speaker is Christopher Rasmussen, professor of humanities and philosophy at Diablo Valley College. Thanks.
All right, looks right. Thank you, Kim, and thank you everyone for being here. Today I'm going to be talking about snacking in hell, which is to say hunger, eating, and inevitably non-consumption in Dante's Inferno. I will be quoting extensively from the Anthony Eslin's translation of the Inferno. I will also be trying really, really hard not to comment on a lot of the great art that is going to be going by very quickly in these slides. Let's get right to it. The context, of course, for Dante is the medieval world, their understanding and thinking about hell. There is all kinds of biting and hunger and things like that going on, being eaten, standard conventional features. We see this all the time. Sometimes it's demons, sometimes it's monsters like dragons, sometimes it's Satan himself, as Giotto is showing us here. There's a very interesting paradox at work with this kind of activity in hell, specifically Christian hell, because going back to people like Augustine, you get this very strong idea about hell being eternal. It never stops. The punishments never stops. They go on forever after Judgment Day. Which means all this biting and chewing and eating, the souls don't go away. They can never be fully eaten. They can never disappear. Now, writing at the very end of these traditions is, of course, the great Florentine poet Dante Alighieri and his spectacular gargantuan epic of this afterlife tour, the Divine Comedy. We are going to be, of course, focusing on the Inferno aspect, which is their trip specifically through hell. And yes, there's all kinds of eating and biting and chewing going on here as well. Now, these are not new ideas that Dante's introducing, but he does work with them in strikingly new and creative ways. He uses them as metaphors, which we're going to be talking about, including a she-wolf. We're going to be talking about punishments inflicted by all kinds of different things. We're also going to be talking about some cannibalism. Dante's creative variety in exploring these themes is exactly what I'm going to be talking about here today. Now, let's start with the metaphors. Yes, Dante uses two very prominent, very interesting metaphors for sinful desires and cravings, and they're both in the form of hungry canines, interestingly enough. Neither of them are internet memes. The first one Dante runs into almost immediately. Dante, at the very beginning of the Inferno, is lost in the woods. He's seeking out the light, but he is blocked by three menacing beasts, a leopard, a lion, and the she-wolf. And it is the she-wolf that is the real problem for Dante. Who's described as one whose scrawniness seems stuffed with all men's cravings, sluggish with desires, who had made many live in wretchedness. Virgil, Dante's guide through hell, also agrees and actually fills in a little bit more information. He describes her as so vicious is her nature, so ill-bent, she never stuffs her ravenous will enough, but after feeding hungers all the more. Even though she's already stuffed with all men's cravings, it will never be enough. She'll continually always want more. There is, needless to say, a massive debate among scholars, and has been forever, about what this metaphorically means for Dante. What does the she-wolf represent to him? Lust is one of the things, but there's a huge debate about this, which we don't have time to get into. The other great metaphor, canine, that Dante introduces us to is from the classical world, Cerberus, guarding the area of gluttons, which is a sin in this Christian context, one of the seven deadly sins. When Dante and Virgil meet Cerberus, we're told that Cerberus, that great worm, caught sight of us. He bared his fangs and opened his maws wide, his muscles taut and not holding one still, as a dog yammering in an agony of greed, straining to eat and nothing else. It's intense hunger, straining to eat and nothing else. Dante's description of Cerberus is almost entirely about the three mouths, the three voracious mouths. Now, gluttons are a standard area in most medieval sensibilities about hell, and usually the sinners being punished in medieval hell for gluttony are forced to eat terrible things: snakes, toads, other nasty things. Interestingly, Dante, as he does in so many different ways, breaks new ground. The gluttons are there, but there is no eating. They are rather just lethargically lying in this kind of disgusting, stinking mud. Kind of the after effects of eating, I guess, is what Dante's going for here. Let's turn to being eaten as infernal punishments, of which there are so many great examples. It's very hard to just focus on a couple, but let's talk about some of the more striking ones. One of the great ones happens when Dante goes to Circle 7 and drops in on the punishment of the suicides. Dante has imagined these figures as having lost their humanity completely. The supreme expression of their life was to destroy their physical bodies, so here they have no physical bodies. They are in fact trees. They also do not have the ability to speak unless and until they start to get chewed upon by these monsters, the harpies that live amongst the branches. Once they start chewing its foliage for their feed, they cause pain, and for that pain create a vent. This is the only way the trees can actually speak, can regain a little semblance of their humanity, is through this eating. Now, as Dante and Virgil are visiting with the suicides, they are interrupted by two figures crashing into the forest. Dante is such a great writer. He creates a sense of immediacy somehow in all of this. And they're running away from something, but what? We learn that these figures are squanderers, and they are being pursued by something. One of them rather feebly tries to hide behind a small bush that he sees there. And we find out what's chasing them almost instantly. It's a pack of vicious dogs. And they spot the guy hiding behind the little bush and rip him apart. Into the squatting soul they sank their teeth and tore apart his muscles into shreds. They carried off those members ripped in pain. Again, he can't die here. So presumably he's going to be reassembled or reintegrated somehow. Dante doesn't really explore how that works. Perhaps the most iconic version of eating that we see in Dante happens right at the end, when Dante and Virgil are accosting Satan, who is colossally huge, we're told. He also is stuck in ice up to his waist. And he has enormous bat wings that are continuously flapping. That is, in fact, why he's frozen. This is water, but the flapping of the wings has frozen everything. The sinners here being punished are all betrayers of one form or another, and their heads are basically sticking up at different levels out of the ice. But it is Satan, of course, that they see. Dante is mostly struck by his head. When I saw 3 faces in his head, how great a marvel it appeared to me. And these 3 faces are all chewing on sinners. In every mouth he gnashed his teeth to grind a sinner as a thresher crushes flax. So there were 3 he put to such great pain. The middle figure has it the worst. That is identified as Judas. He is getting eaten head first, unlike the other 2, Brutus and Cassius. Interestingly, Brutus and Cassius have no connection at all to the Christian story, of course. They go back to, Roman politics and the Republic. Judas, of course, does make quite a bit more sense. By the way, Satan is not enjoying this at all, though he's inflicting punishments himself. We are told that he is unhappy. With his 6 eyes he wept, and down 3 chins dribbled his tears, and slavers slick with blood. Yeah, like that one. Let's move on and talk a bit about cannibalism in the Inferno. There are some great examples. Yes, monsters and animals and Satan are all doing some interesting stuff, but in terms of anthropophagy, there is some really interesting things going on, which means from now on we're just talking about humans biting humans. The first case where they meet, this is amongst the wrathful. These are people who had given their lives over to anger, and thus the punishment Dante assigns them is to forever be involved in this melee, ripping each other apart. This is Canto 8, if you're all curious. Dante specifically tells us that the biting is a big part of this. They thumped each other not with hands alone, but with the head, the chest, the feet, the teeth, snapping to rip each other limb from limb. Dante actually, in this area, recognizes a sworn enemy of his, a guy named Filippo Argente, and he actually directs other sinners to attack him. And they do. Kind of remarkably. Dante sort of concludes this section by saying, "Soon after I saw the mud melee rake him apart just as I could have wished, for which I praise and thank God to this day." Another very, very interesting example of this kind of anthropophagy, a more singular example, happens when Dante are visiting the falsifiers. And he's speaking with this one soul. He seems to know, there's some suggestion that this is a connection to an old school chum, Capocchio. In any case, in Canto 30, just as Dante's finished talking to him, he's attacked. One of them got Capocchio, sank his tusk into the neck, and as he dragged him off, made him rake his gut on the ground. It sounds like a big cat kind of attacking something. We learn the identity of the attacker. He's a guy named Gianni Schicchi, who in his frenzy mangles us like that. And though I said I would resist talking about art, I cannot resist talking about this a little bit. This is a spectacular work. It's very famously connected to the Inferno by William Adolphe Bouguereau, Dante and Virgil in Hell. It is spectacularly beautiful, of course. The conception of it, the composition, almost photorealistic figures in the foreground. It's called Dante and Virgil in Hell, but frankly, they're in the background. Dante's actually in shadow. It's like he's not supposed to even see him there. The central spotlit figures are the guys in question, Capocchio and this Gianni Schicchi. These struggling figures, again, lots of bulging muscles and veins, super dramatic poses, the detail that's fingers pulling on the skin. It looks like much more of a vampire bite, by the way, to me, than what Dante seems to describe. And though this is a moment of intense violence in Dante's text, I have to say that many modern viewers, or at least all of my students, are struck by the homoeroticism of the central figures. Probably the showcasing of naked men grappling with each other in a very intense and intimate and spectacular detail, which, by the way, is super interesting if you know about Bouguereau's art. He's actually, I think, much more famous for making the female form many, many times in spectacular detail. It's amazingly great stuff. Anyway, back to Dante. Probably the most interesting creative use of cannibalism happens in cantos 24 and 25, where Dante and Virgil encounter the thieves who seem to be assaulted and bitten by snakes. And if you're thinking bitten by snakes does not sound like cannibalism, please be patient, because it actually is. There are two different things that happen when the snakes bite, we're told. Remarkable series of transformation. The first one involves spontaneous, not spontaneous combustion, but combustion, incineration. A man can't scrawl an iron as fast as he ignited and went up in flames and disappeared in a collapse of ash. And after they're in ash, they actually reconstitute in a kind of magical way. The second outcome of being bitten by a snake is even weirder. In fact, Dante seems to be aware that this is going to be a hard sell. He actually breaks the fourth wall to say, I get why you might be skeptical about this. The second outcome involves a new kind of snake, which has 6 legs, which just go on. They magically grapple and bite and somehow come so close, cling so closely to the sinner that they basically switch identities. A kind of mystical smoke passes between the two, and they're transformed into the other. But the most important and best and most dramatic example of cannibalism in the Inferno happens right near the end. Yes, not long before Dante and Virgil actually meet Satan. It is here that Dante sees sinners. Again, their heads are just barely sticking up out of the ice. And Dante notices one that catches his attention, because I saw 2 frozen in one hole in such a way that one man's head was like the other's hood. As they get closer, it becomes clear what's actually going on there. And as a hunk of bread is chewed in hunger, so did the top soul tear his teeth into the other, where the neck joins the brain. We learn that the chewer is a figure known as Count Ugolino. The one being chewed upon is the Archbishop Ruggieri. Dante, quick background here. Count Ugolino was a near contemporary of Dante's, a rather powerful general politician, actually seized control of the city of Pisa for a while. He's mostly famous for what happens that Dante describes here, which is falling into the hands of his enemies, being imprisoned in a tower along with his sons, and eventually being starved to death. Ugolino describes this. Because Dante does this so well, I'm going to let Dante do the speaking for me here for these next few slides. When I awoke before the break of dawn, I heard my small sons sobbing in their dreams, for they were with me, and they asked for bread. Then they awakened, and the hour drew near when food was always brought us. But we grew afraid as each of us recalled his dreams. They had all had violent nightmares the night before. And I could hear them nailing up the door of the horrible tower, and gazed upon the faces of my sons and spoke no more. The hunger begins to take its toll. I did not weep. I had so turned to stone. They wept. And my little Anselm said, "Father, why do you stare like that? What's wrong?" When a weak glint of daylight made its way into our prison of sorrow, and I saw my own face in the four that looked at me, I bit both hands for grief. And they, who thought I must be longing for some food to eat, suddenly rose and came to me and said, "Father, for us it would be much less pain if you ate us instead. You clothed us with this wretched flesh, now strip it off again." I calmed myself, lest they grow sadder still. The next day and all the next we did not speak. Ah, hard earth, why did you not open up? And when we had arrived on the 4th day, my Gatto fell outstretched before my feet, saying, "Papa, why don't you help me?" There he died. As clearly as you see me here, I watched the other 3 drop one by one the 5th and 6th days. Then I flung myself, already blind, groping upon each one. 2 days I called their name when they were dead. And then one of the most controversial and debated lines in all of Dante. I'm not going to do the Italian. My Italian's terrible. But it's basically a line that is always translated, "Then hunger did what sorrow could not do." From the very beginning of Dante's scholarship, there's been huge debate about what that actually means. Yes, Ugolino dies. That's very clear. But it has been argued very effectively, I think, that what is being suggested here, Ugolino, in desperation and delusion, started to eat the remains of his own sons. When he's done telling his story, he returns back to his human feast. Having said that, he turned his eyes askance and took the wretched skull between his teeth, tough as a dog that gnaws down to the bone. unlike Dante, I do not have time to put a kind of happy ending at the end of this. I just need to leave it there. But again, a bit of a survey of how Dante treats in such creative variety these issues of hunger and eating and all that kind of stuff. It still works even 800 years later in translation, which is kind of amazing. So, thank you very much.
So, questions? For any of our panelists or all? Or now you're all hungry? Yes. Oh, sorry, I'm supposed to bring you the mic, yes.
So, quick question for Asa and Kim. You said that in Gauther they use the term fiend. What's the kind of context there? Are we talking about a sort of wild person? Are we talking about a demon?
The representation is Merlin, so that somehow the connection is to Merlin, a kind of demonic Merlin. Oh, sorry, the connection is to a kind of demonic version of Merlin, relation of Merlin. Yeah.
Who is, in some of the accounts, sired himself by a demon.
Other questions or comments for our panelists? Yes, Allison.
Hi. So I guess my question is for Vale, but on the topics that we've all heard about, like what are the limits, maybe the ethical limits, the practical limits of somatic practices when we're trying to maybe embody or empathize or understand some of these stories?
Unfortunately, I was personally inspired by Marina Abramovich, which means I'll push myself as far as I can go. But I actually hit this point where I wanted to open it up as a workshop, and I got to this point of thinking, knowing what I went through and the fact that like it unearthed way more than I bargained for, I can't ask anybody else to do that unless they are fully informed of the risk that they're taking. So I don't know when I will be able to invite people into this project with me for sake of ethics. But this is also something that I teach. And so if anybody's also interested in pushing themselves to the extreme, let me know. That's for me personally. Yeah. If it's my body, it's my choice.
I admit my answer is a bit snarkier, but we did learn as we were researching this that there was a medievalist specialist in ivory sculpture, and that his method for dating them was biting them, and that he claimed by doing so he could date them. The limits are, we don't bite the art.
Other questions? Yes.
Thank you. I have two questions for Vale. I noticed you have some tattoos. I was wondering if you have any experience or any like recommendations writing about tattooing or using tattooing like as a sort of like experience that impacts your writing and research.
That just sounds rad as hell. This is Sharpie. This is the actual tattoo. I do have actual tattoos. This is Sharpie. So I'm going to talk about the Sharpie instead of your question, I think. And maybe this will inspire you to continue, because that's rad. I really like that. It makes me think about pain. In connection with that. So actually, this is just my ritualistic thing. Anytime I talk about Loudun, I write down the name of every single sister that was recorded as experiencing this possession. And this is just my way of embodying. This is my way of carrying them with me to remind myself who I'm talking to, and talking with, and trying to elevate. Do what you were thinking about, though. That sounds really rad.
Other questions or comments? Yes.
You may have already,
I think for the recording, you need that.
you may have responded to this, but this practice that came of this, etudes, if we could call them that. I'm a theater guy. Have you had others watch? And you said you're not an actor, but because I'm like, I would be into watching that.
And I said in my abstract when I submitted it, hey, I'll do it in person. And then, like I said before, I had some health complications. You were this close to being able to watch it. Sorry, my guy. There will come a time. There will come a time when it needs to be witnessed. It first needed to be researched. And for my research sessions, because I'm not an actor, I'm not used to the vulnerability of being perceived in that moment. And I knew that for this stage of research, I needed to be alone. I needed to be alone with my body. I needed to be alone with the ghost of the past. I was not ready for a community seance yet. But stay tuned. Stay tuned. Who knows what's going to happen next and when?
So I was curious, as you're talking about performing this, do you feel like it will be more difficult to form something that was a collective, a group of women, and then doing it solo, or do you feel like you would want others in something like this?
Oh no, we have to have others. We have to have others because I can only speak from a place of white trans madness. And in order for this to be in full communication, I have to have intersectionality that I can speak to. So someday there will be community when I can explain and give full information so that people can consent. But again, as soon as I get there, it needs to be community and multiple intersections need to be addressed.
Other questions or comments? Yes.
Okay, I'm having a hard time formulating this question, but maybe I think you will all be able to help me out. But one thing I've been thinking about is like the idea of the corpus, or like the body of work in literature, and with like Dante especially, but how that also relates to the physical body, and even across like these medieval and classical works, like practices of the Eucharist and in religious imagery. And in the keynote lecture yesterday, Dr. Smith talked about like the wafer too. So maybe if any of you could help me like connect those ideas in my head, or talk about how you think about those themes in your research.
I do not want to dominate again. I had several questions. Do you guys have
Well, just speaking about Dante, there is a huge amount of scholarship about, especially the Ugolino business and the sons, and parallels to gospel passages and things like that. I'm not sure where to take this exactly, or how to help you with this, but there's a huge amount of information and discussion about that. Indeed, I didn't have time to address any of it, but Dante, he's a poet, he's an artist, not a theologian, but he obviously cares deeply about theology, and so it's the fingerprints are everywhere in the poem, I would say. So, it's a ton of it. Yeah.
And Lena, do you want to follow up on that kind of question about embodiment, the way that's working in relationship to gender in the two texts that you're looking at, because I feel like that's really a central dimension of what you're getting at in your reading.
Sure. So just to make sure that I address all of your points, could you repeat your question one more time for me? Is that okay?
Yes, it's more of like a word vomit than a cohesive question. But I think some of the things that stuck out to me about all of the panels, and then in your work as well with Milton and like the religious imagery there, is the relationship between the metaphors of like fingerprints in the work and the body of work or the corpus of work having to do with actual embodiment. I don't know if that makes sense either. I'm sorry.
You're good. I don't know where to start with this, so I'm also going to word vomit as well.
Amazing.
So for me, I'm a little bit all over the place. If your question is about kind of like figuring out, I guess like a corpus, as you said, I might be the worst person to ask. Again, like I'm all over the place, and I kind of just like pursue what it is that I'm interested in. And if I somehow find a connection between two works, then I'm like, oh boy, like I am going to do this thing. This paper, this idea literally came from Paradise Lost being in the Tituba text, and I was like, what is this about? You know, so I'm kind of like, I'm just looking for things that excite and interest me that have like connections across like a bunch of other things I'm interested in. In terms of, I guess just looking at like bodies and gender, I believe, Kim, you were asking about. Yeah, and could you repeat your question again as well?
I was thinking about the way that gender and embodiment are pretty central to both of the texts that you're playing with and to the ideas of the making of the feminine monstrous, right? Mm-hmm. So I thought maybe you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Right. So for, I don't know, as you could probably see, I really liked Milton's Eve. And when I first read through it, I was unsure of what it was that he was trying to say about Eve. In the original Bible, there wasn't much said about Eve at all. She was just kind of there. She was the one that sinned and caused the fall. But Milton really gave her a lot richer of an interior life. And for Tituba, she is also a very complex character and person. This is a fictional Tituba. There is a real Tituba that Condé based her Tituba on. But she also, in a way, kind of like Milton did with Eve, gave her Tituba a lot more life than what was provided to her through manuscripts and other like paper evidence. And I really did appreciate what these two authors did for their women characters and imbuing them with a lot more opportunity to be people and to kind of explore more deeply what it is that makes them different, special, marvelous, and monstrous. Does that make sense? Also a word vomit. Very sorry about that.
We also, Asa has something different to say, but I'm interested in very early literature. So what you're talking about in terms of the corpus is very different. It's one thing if the corpus is written, and it's another thing if the corpus is oral. So all of this work on disciplining the mouth and what the mouth is supposed to do speaks very clearly to how that body of literature is supposed to look and what it's supposed to carry forward.
What I was thinking about is, so we work on really old stuff. There very rarely is any known authorship. So for the Frank's Casket, we have no idea who made it. We have only the vaguest suggestions that maybe it was made at the monastery at Ripon. I don't know. Maybe. But we do actually have a body. We have a thing, an actual tangible thing, and that body talks about the body out of which it was made, which is the whale's body. And so I'm not really interested in figuring out like who made the Frank's Casket, but I'm very interested in the body that gave us the Frank's Casket, which is to say the whale or whales who washed themselves presumably up on the shore, or perhaps were whaled to get there, and thinking about and remembering those bodies as we look at this body of literature/art that is the Frank's Casket.
I have 5 seconds of comment. in early modern, late medieval, the body is entirely coded. So when you're using the body in literature or ritual or performance, everything is kind of coded because there's already like a metaphorical symbol embedded in it. It makes like a difference if you're talking about your left or your right ear, for instance.
I just want to add one thing about the casket, which is giving material form to a very old genre of the neck riddle, which is what happens usually to save someone's life at the end of a folk narrative. But it often is a riddle about death. And so this neck riddle, and it often involves an object like a horse's skull is a very common one that birds nest in and are born out of. And so this sarcophagus, is it? A casket. Yeah, when I saw it, it was smaller from the photos that you had than I anticipated. But it feels like, because of the way you highlighted the riddle dimension of it, like a materialization, like almost an embodiment to mark a kind of death that is bringing into reality a specific genre that's related to death. So anyways, I just was curious about, just an observation from a folklorist.
Very brief. Yes, fascinating. One of the purported uses for it, maybe not its original, but it was apparently on an altar in a small church in France, serving as a reliquary, which would mean an actual box housing death within it. Yeah.
I believe we're at time, and I believe there is lunch to be had downstairs outside. So thank you, everybody, for joining this panel.